Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zeng here, and earlier today, the Pokemon Company International announced the Series 5 VGC 2020 rule set. This rule set goes in effect on July 1st, and it basically incorporates all the new Pokemon that have been added via the DLC. As you can imagine, this is drastically going to shake up what the VGC 2020 metagame and landscape looks like, so I wanted to make a brief video just going over the rules and then talking about some early meta impressions, what Pokemon you might expect to see, what Pokemon I think will be good, and some potential counters to some of those strategies. So this isn't going to get super in-depth, but I just wanted to go over some of the key points and give you a picture of what VGC is going to look like basically 2 weeks from now. So I hope you find this helpful, and there are a bunch of links in the description below that will help you follow along, including the actual rules document. First of all, let's talk about some key points from the Series 5 rules update. Urshifu and its G-Max version will be legal, more on that later, but of course that's a really big deal because Urshifu has quite the incredible ability and of course has a strong base attack. All the Pokemon from the DLC are going to be legal as well, and that includes all released G-Max forms. So the starter G-Maxes, basically Venusaur, Blastoise, Intelleon, Cinderace, and Rillaboom are all going to be legal. Yolan starters are legal, nothing too crazy about that. This next point is one that I have to say I personally was not expecting. Terrakion, Cobalion, and Virizion are all going to be legal via the Battle Tower transfer. So if you don't know what that is, basically now in-game via the Battle Tower, you can actually go to somebody and they can make your Pokemon legal for competitive play. When I mean legal, I mean basically give it the ribbon that allows it to participate, similar like when you breed a Pokemon and catch a Pokemon in Sword and Shield. So what this transfer allows you to do basically is take your Virizion, your Cobalion, your Terrakion from Black and White or other games, bring it all the way over to Sword and Shield, and actually make them legal for competitive play in ranked battles and in VGC. So through that, you can use those Pokemon, and I think that's actually a really big deal. I did not see this coming personally, and these Pokemon are all, like Terrakion especially, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but these all have, you know, really good speed stats. They have really interesting typing as well, so I think that's a super big deal. All Isle of Armor move tutors are legal, no surprise there, but of course that is a big deal because so many of these tutor moves are actually really strong, so you should expect to see some strategies around those. And finally, all the Alolan forms of Galar legal Pokemon are also legal. Once again, these rules go in effect online on ranked battles on July 1st. You can already play them casually in-game, but if you want to go on the ranked ladder, this will start in basically less than 2 weeks. So get ready for it. Let's actually talk about the metagame, though, and some of my early impressions. I want to start this off with Urshifu because I know this is a Pokemon that caused a lot of concern. And people didn't know if it would be allowed in VGC. People were like, this ability is crazy. You can attack through Protect. Protect is so common in VGC. This is going to be the most broken thing in VGC history. Here are my thoughts on it. I think Urshifu undoubtedly is going to be a big threat in VGC 2020, but I don't think it's going to be like absolutely busted and broken enough to the point where like every team basically needs to have one. Is Urshifu going to be good? Are you going to see it? Absolutely. But is it going to be so busted to the point where it's nearly unbeatable? I don't really think so. First of all, let me preface this with the fact that I expect the Rapid Strike version to be more popular, mainly because I think the typing of the other version is just super weak in this metagame. Being 4x weak, I think Teferi is not super strong. That being said, I can definitely see players opting for both their versions. I just think the Rapid Strike version, aka the Water type version, will be more common, at least in the first couple of weeks, because it seems like that is the set that people are kind of gravitating towards. So the reason why I don't think it's going to be absolutely busted is because it has several common weaknesses in terms of typing, right? So for example, Rapid Strike Urshifu is weak to Fairy, Electric, Grass, Fighting. I think a lot of these weaknesses are actually pretty exploitable, and it's also outsped by some of the strongest attackers in the game. For example, Dragapult and Cinderace, our two Pokemon, are really dominating the metagame right now. Both of those are able to outspeed Urshifu and even go for something like a super effective Max Airstream onto it. That being said, you cannot have a team that basically doesn't have answers against Urshifu, and that's really the case for like all the top Pokemon in VGC. Now we're just adding this Pokemon to the list of that list, right? So Urshifu is just still able to do so much damage with its ability, and as a result, you have to respect it greatly, especially as a lead option. For example, I think a lot of players in VGC will like to lead something that wants to protect on the first turn while having a support-oriented Pokemon. For example, Whimsicott plus something that's really strong, and that maybe strong Pokemon is a mid-tier speed. So you go for a Protect turn 1, go for a Tailwind, and then sweep from there. Similarly, you do the same stuff with like Trick Room setups with Dusclops plus something. As a result, you can't go for leads like that nearly as easily if your opponent has an Urshifu in Team Preview, because you have to respect the fact that it can just go for its regular attacks or even Gigantamax and just attack you through your Protect or Max card. So you have to respect it greatly, and that I think plays a key role in Team Preview. I also think that Arcanine and Incineroar usage may end up going down a little bit because Urshifu gets super effective attacks. Of course, with its signature attack, it can go for multiple critical hits onto either Arcanine or Incineroar. Those are, of course, super effective hits, and by maxing, you also just do so much more damage. So, because Urshifu is water and fighting typing, yeah, we might see Arcanine and Incineroar usage go down a little bit. Still not sure about that because, of course, Intimidate's still just so good, but that's just a conjecture that I have. I know a lot of people are freaking about Urshifu, so I wanted to talk about some potential counters. I'll make a more in-depth Urshifu guide in a bit once I actually play with the Pokemon and feel comfortable with it and feel like I'm giving you good, insight onto it. But until then, I wanted to just kind of talk about some counters or some ways you could check it, just what I theoried in the last couple of hours. So, first of all, I think like bulky water-type Pokemon will be valuable against it, especially something like Gastrodon, which can be used for its ability Storm Drain. You can redirect those water-type attacks away. I also think Pokemon like Primarina and Rotom Wash have a lot of value. These are Pokemon that are trained often to be quite defensive, but also can retaliate with a ton of damage back against Urshifu, especially the water-type version. I also think faster Pokemon with super effective attacks, especially when you have Helping Hand support from something like Togekiss or Whimsicott, can be really valuable. For example, think about Max Lightning Life Orb Durant, partner with Helping Hand. That can just pick up a one-hit KO and outspeed Urshifu. You can also go for Charizard with Sun, for example. Just go for a Sun-boosted Max Airstream, pick up the one-hit KO with Life Orb, even if Urshifu has Assault Vest. So there are a bunch of these attackers. I earlier mentioned the Cinderace and the Dragapult, both which can outspeed and go for something like a Max Airstream as well. So just faster Pokemon in general that are like base speed is naturally faster, plus something like a Whimsicott can add a lot of value. However, you don't necessarily need to always outspeed it. I also think there are a fair amount of slower Pokemon that can take a hit and KO it in return. For example, something like Dracozolt, which is a little bit slower, or G-Max Rillaboom. Both of these are really strong, especially if you throw a Life Orb onto them. Dracozolt often with the Hustle and Max Lightning can just pick up a KO. And G-Max Rillaboom, if you set up the Grassy Surge, which is natural from its ability, you have such a strong base 160 Grassy Surge boosted, Stab boosted, Life Orb boosted attack. I think that can also just potentially pick up the knockout onto Urshifu. So there are still a fair amount of attackers I think that can be really, really good against this. And finally, just strong special attackers in general. This thing has a base special defense of 60. It's not that high. So I think a lot of Urshifu sets early on might tend towards something like Assault Vest or just one of those offensive items. But even with Assault Vest, still can't take special attacks super well, and if you're committing Assault Vest onto it, means you can't boost your damage output from your G-Max form. I think it's also important to note that Protect is not as common in this metagame as previous VGC formats, especially because of something like Dynamax, and so as a result, I think Urshifu in previous formats I think would have really scared me, but there are a fair amount of things that I think will give this Pokemon some trouble. So to reiterate my thoughts, yes, this is going to be a strong Pokemon, but I'm not sure it's going to be so broken to the point that every team basically requires one. I certainly hope that's not the case, and I hope that I don't regret these words in a couple of weeks or months from now. Those are just my first thoughts, though. I do think there are a fair amount of counters I can already think work against this, and we'll just kind of see how they are applied once we actually start playing against it. However, I don't want you guys to underestimate this Pokemon. It will still be very strong, and its ability is something that we just really haven't seen, before in VGC and competitive play. So definitely a Pokemon I don't want you to sleep on. Let's talk about the Swords of Justice, which refers to Terrakion, Virizion, and Cobalion. This, I think, is pretty crazy, and I think that Terrakion is a Pokemon that a lot of competitive players are already talking about. I think a lot of people are instantly going to flock to it, especially in the first couple of weeks. For those of you that played VGC almost a decade ago, Terrakion was actually really popular with Whimsicott for the same strategies that you see it nowadays with, for example, Lucario and Arcanine, which is beat up. However, Terrakion has really nice type coverage with Rock and Fighting. In fact, even regular Terrakion does so much damage with a +4 Rock Slide. It's also very, very fast and outspeeds the majority of the metagame, so you should definitely expect to see Terrakion plus Whimsicott once again. This is even scarier, of course, because now Terrakion can carry something like a Life Orb, or it can go for something like a Type Resist Berry. I mean, there are just so many options onto it. A Lumberry, for example. So this is a classic combination from 2011, and you should absolutely expect to see it. I think the early metagame will consist of a lot of Terrakion. This might just be a meta-defining Pokemon. I think a lot of players are currently thinking this is a Pokemon that will be a really, really big deal even after the early metagame, so be prepared for it. As I was mentioning, in VGC, when you're building a team, you always want to have a good answer against at least like the top 20, 25 threats. Terrakion and the Urshifu, I think, will definitely be within those threats. I also think that Virizion and Cobalion actually will be a lot more viable than the previous years where they were basically never played. I mean, Cobalion basically didn't see any play in all the years of VGC that was allowed in. Virizion saw a little bit of use in maybe, say, 2015. I think there were some teams I can remember it with, mainly because it can, you know, do some pretty good damage with stab, grass type attacks. But I actually think both of those will be a lot more viable in a format that is kind to with Dynamax, because you can get some really interesting boosts. Cobalion especially with those steel spikes. So I think like of course, Terrakion is going to be the first Pokemon people flock to in terms of beta combinations, but I actually think Virizion and Cobalion are both very viable as well, especially because like something like a +4 max steel spike sounds really scary from Cobalion, especially if it's like Assault Vest. Not only do you get a defense boost, you have the Assault Vest from the, or you have a special defense boost from Assault Vest, and then getting natural boosts from beat up also sounds very, very scary. So you should expect to see these Pokemon often supported with Tailwind, especially beat up. I mentioned Whimsicott earlier, that is going to be the #1 partner, but things like Dragapult, Weavile, and Persian, which are all faster beat up users than these, can also work. Of course, there are also even slower beat up users you can use like Mimikyu, which maybe could be a little bit more niche, but could certainly play a role as well. So I think these Pokemon will be a big deal, Terrakion being by far the biggest threat out of the three, at least in the early metagame. Let's talk about the new Gigantamax forms. We've seen a lot of Gigantamax Pokemon throughout VGC 2020, and now there's 6 new forms that we can use, the 5 starters and Urshifu. So I think Venusaur and Rillaboom can just so easily replace their counterparts on the current existing teams. A lot of teams that have Venusaur, you know, often kind of use it as a flex pick where you don't necessarily need to max it. You'll have Sleep Powder, but maybe also Life Orb, so it has the option of maxing. And I think the effect of just getting that residual damage every turn is such a big deal for something like Venusaur. That's a reason why Charizard and Colossal were both highly successful throughout the course of the season up to now. So as a result, I think G-Max Venusaur can just easily replace regular Venusaur. You're not often maxing and doing that much damage with Max Overgrowth anyway. And even for Max Overgrowth to get value, you basically need that you need to set up the terrain and use it a second time, right? So I think you can really easily replace their regular part that you see. Similarly, Rillaboom already sets up the grassy terrain with its ability, so I don't really see too much added reason to use G-Max Rillaboom, or sorry, regular Rillaboom. However, I will note that I think as the metagame becomes more terrain focused, especially because of the tutor moves, you might see people revert back to the regular forms. But right now, naturally, I think these can really easily replace their current normal counterparts. Blastoise is a Pokemon that we really haven't seen much usage of until now. And even the Blastoise sets we've seen, even for example on Road to Ranked, and the Blastoise sets that we went up against, maybe it's like a Shell Smash set. I think the best set for it currently that we've seen is the one we used on 45 Mice's team, which features Yawn, and is a really support-oriented Blastoise. However, with Gigantamax Blastoise, I think now there's maybe some more room for some offensive sets that can really work. So I expect this Pokemon to be at least explored a little bit more, just because it's one that really wasn't used offensively, and the offensive ones I felt like just weren't very good in the metagame. So now we have, of course, Intelleon, Urshifu, and Cinderace. Inteleon's interesting, right? Because I think Gastron usage might see a rise due to Urshifu. So if we expect Gastron to rise, then I think Inteleon will want to go for the Gigantamax form most of the time, because just having something, you know, nullify a base 160 power attack feels so bad. Regular Inteleon still has some usage, though. Of course, weather is such a big deal in this metagame, especially with rain coming back. More on that in a little bit. So for that reason, like, Cinderace and Inteleon might want to go for their normal forms for the weather control, which could be a big deal depending on the teams that they're on. But of course, the Gigantamax versions are always pretty safe, and they just do so much damage. A base 160 stab boosted attack is just absolutely incredible. And finally, with Urshifu, I think most of the time you're probably going to want to run a Gigantamax. The ability to just attack their max guard is honestly really incredible. So yeah, but you know, as always, there could be some niche opportunities for the regular forms. However, at the end of the day, I think all of these Gigantamax forms are actually quite viable, unlike, you know, a lot of the previous updates where maybe like 2 or 3 Gigantamax forms were good. I think all 5 to 6 of these are going to be pretty viable and going to be seen a lot, especially because Venusaur, Blastoise, Rillaboom, and Cinderace are already used a lot, right? So it's like, now you just give them more options and more tools. Sorry, I didn't mean the Blastoise, Venusaur, Rillaboom, and Cinderace. Inteleon has seen a little bit, and I actually think that might see a increase in usage, mainly because of how fast it is. It's able to outspeed a lot of these, you know, currently fast Pokemon like Cinderace or Terrakion, which, like I said, I expect to be pretty good. From the DLC, here is a list of Pokemon that I think you guys should definitely expect to see. So I've already mentioned some of these, like the Terrakion, the Cobalion, and the Virizion. But you also have some really interesting options, right? Rain is now back in the metagame with Politoed and Kingdra. Azumarill, which was kind of a really good Pokemon in the late 2015 metagame, is now back. And I'll be making a video on this coming in the next couple of days that covers sample sets and how you might expect to see these Pokemon being played, so stay tuned for that. But these are just my first impressions. A lot of these Pokemon historically have been very good in VGC. VGC, and so for that reason, I think, you know, they're early contenders for strong Pokemon in this metagame. I want to caveat that with the fact, though, that, for example, there are some Pokemon that were absolutely dominant in previous VGC formats. For example, Aegislash, or even Mamoswine, both of those having had very good performances throughout, you know, many VGC years. Both of those Pokemon basically saw no usage coming into this format, and, you know, some players use them, but they are definitely not very meta standard. So for that reason, I wouldn't say all of these Pokemon are immediately going to be very good in the metagame. It's just a snapshot of things that were good previously / might still be good, right? So you've got Azumarill, Crocodile, which offers another Intimidate Pokemon. Porygon 2 is another bulky Trick Room user that can also function a little bit more offensively. Amoonguss for Spore and Redirection. Magnezone is a really interesting Steel Pokemon with Sturdy, so you can, you know, guarantee take a hit. I think Steel typing is always just really good in this metagame, especially with Pokemon like Togekiss running around. Talonflame and Volcarona are both really interesting options. Talonflame more for just fast tailwinds and support, also gets some good damage off. Volcarona for potential Quiver Dance sets or your support sets. We've talked about Cobalion and Virizion. Alolan Marowak, which could be really interesting if you're able to, say, set up Trick Room. It's a Pokemon that can Dynamax and do a ton of damage. And finally, Alakazam is actually something that people have been spamming with Indeedee, just using the new tutor move and doing a ton of damage. So I think that might die out later on, but it's something like people might tend to earlier meta just because it's really easy to use and it's pretty exploitable. Of course, there are a bunch of other Pokemon from the DLC that you might run into as well, and this list obviously doesn't cover everything, but they were just some of the ones that jumped to my mind that I think will be competitively viable. There's still a bunch that are fully evolved that I think players certainly may use. I just don't think they'll be beyond, like, you know, top 2%. Sorry, like, more than 2% of teams will feature them. So these are all kind of more niche picks, but there are ones that I think teams can certainly feature. Of course, there is the Galarian Slowbro as well as the regular Slowking, both which can operate for Trick Room teams. You've got Lilligant, which was often used with, like, Torkoal, for example. I don't think Lilligant's as good because after use stuff just isn't nearly as strong as previous formats because of Dynamax. But you've got a lot of stuff here. Chansey for Alloy Switch shenanigans. Scizor, I really want to make work. I don't think it'll be super good because something like Durant just does a lot more damage, and Bullet Crunch, which was kind of what you would use Scizor for previously, just isn't nearly as good because of Dynamax. Poliwrath, I think, is an interesting rain option. Meowscarada for Fake Out. The Sandcastle, you can do some cool gimmicky stuff with it. And then Porygon Z and Lycanroc. So once again, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. It's just some thoughts that jumped into my head of Pokemon that I think you might run into. But certainly doesn't mean that you're not going to see the Pokemon that aren't on this list, and it doesn't mean you will guaranteed run into these in your battles. But I would say this first list is a list that you should definitely prepare for. I would expect to see a lot of these in your future battles, whereas this list is like a little bit more niche, but you could definitely build some really strong strategies around some of these Pokemon. So, if you want a list of overall strategies to prepare for, I do apologize because it's a little text heavy, but Rain, I think, is going to be something that a lot of players are naturally gravitating towards. Rain, with Politoed being back now, is a big deal. Of course, Pelipper just wasn't exactly the best Rain user, and it was the only option, you know, up until now. Not only Politoed, though, you also have Kingdra, right, which can do a lot of damage, especially in Dynamax form. Ludicolo previously was around, can still be used. Now you've got other tools like Urshifu and Amoonguss as well. I mean, Urshifu, when Rain is set up, can just do a lot of damage with its max moves. And Amoonguss, of course, just has good natural synergy in terms of typing and can go for redirection. We kind of talked about beat up already, but you should definitely expect to see Whimsicott plus other beat up users, like I mentioned earlier, combined with those three justified users in Terrakion, Cobalion, and Virizion. I think Perish Song is a little bit more viable now. Perish Song is kind of an underexplored strategy. We haven't seen too many players use it. It's always not like a very common strategy in any year, but Politoed and Amoonguss make it, I think, tougher to go up against. Of course, previously you would see this partnered with things like G-Max Anaconda or Sentra Scorch for the traps. You'd see maybe G-Max Lapras as well with Perish Song. So I think there's just more options to it. I don't think it'll be super common, but you should be prepared for it. Tailwind in general, I think, is going to be especially common. It's something that's already been, you know, growing in popularity again because of Cinderace being released. So many players are using Hyper Offense with Cinderace, but now with Urshifu and Terrakion as well. I think an easy answer for a lot of players is like, okay, click the Tailwind button, Dynamax with one of those, and kind of just sweep through. So expect to see more of that, and that's mainly going to be coming from Pokemon like Whimsicott and Talonflame. Psychic Spam is interesting. I wasn't really aware that this was going to be a popular strategy, but it appears a fair amount of people are using this on Showdown currently. And you can actually use Alakazam with that, or Hatterene plus Indeedee, and use the move Expanding Forts, which basically does increase damage with the Psychic terrain up. So it's just a really, really strong option. You just kind of use these strong Psychic type attacks immediately. Kind of reminiscent of like 2020, where you could use, you know, Side Spam with like Tapu Lele and, you know, different Psychic type Pokemon. And finally, like, updated Trick Room, I think is interesting. You have a bunch of new Trick Room users in Porygon 2, Galarian, Slowbro, and Slowking. I think Alolan Marowak also looks very, very scary, especially if you Dynamax it. It can just do so much damage. So be prepared. I mean, Trick Room is just always a consistent strategy, and now there's just more ways to set it up. Finally, more terrain-focused strategies from the new moves, a lot of which take advantage of terrains, I think are definitely exploitable as well. That's something that I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive. I haven't personally taken a in-depth look into it yet, but I do expect players to use strategies around that, like the Psychic Spam strategy that I mentioned earlier. Of course, you don't want to forget about the old stuff either, right? Because yes, the metagame is going to look different, but these strategies were proven to be really, really effective in the Series 4 and Series 1 through 4 in VGC 2020. So don't forget about them. They might get a little bit less popular. We're going to have to see how the metagame shakes out, what kind of team compositions kind of fall out of usage, but I would still, at least on your first team, kind of prepare for them. You at least want some answer against them, right? Sun plus Trick Room historically has been so good, things like Charizard, Torkoal, Dusclops, and now you can, of course, go for Gigantamax Venusaur on those teams, which makes it even a little bit more of a potent threat. Sand has been good since day one, and I think is still very good in this format, so you want to cover for that option. As I mentioned, hyper-offensive Tailwind teams, like the team we were using on Road to Rank, Grand Mamedy's team, as well as just so many other Cinderace teams are just super, super strong, so you want to be prepared for them, especially because of Cinderace, and of course, now Cinderace can also even go for a Gigantamax. Hard Trick Room has been good. It's been good since day one. Still expect it to be good. I expect to see teams like that. I think the fact that we played 2 on Road to Rank in the last couple of days is telling that it's still a very consistent option. Teams are just often kind of not prepared to deal with so much Hard Trick Room. So, yeah, you still want answers against that. I think one thing that's been really interesting, especially in the last couple of weeks, is kind of the hybrid between Trick Room and Tailwind. You'll sometimes see teams that carry both, right? And even if Tailwind's not on, you'll have Pokemon that can max Airstream, something like Cinderace, for example. So get prepared for those cores. Cores, for example, like Drifbloom and Rillaboom, but also have like Dusclops and Primarina. Cores that have Whimsicott, Cinderace, but also Dusclops, Primarina, or Dusclops, Conkeldurr. You want to be able to not say, okay, like, have ways to shut down both of those and not say, okay, I have to commit all of the early game to shutting down Trick Room, and then when they don't go Trick Room, you're just in a lot of trouble. And finally, just the generic good stuffs that we've seen, things like Dragapult, Togekiss, Excadrill, Rotom, Tyranitar, Venusaur, Incineroar, for example, a bunch of the strongest Pokemon thrown together on the same team you want to be prepared for. So don't forget about these strategies because they are still going to be very relevant. And of course, VGC 2020 is going to look a little bit different. It's going to look a lot different, but I think a lot of the old fundamentals will still stick around. So be prepared for that. This is still going to be, it's kind of like a new format, but a lot of the old stuff will still come back. So, in summary, what are the main takeaways you should get from this video? First of all, I think Terrakion and Urshifu are going to be 2 of the biggest threats. Maybe Urshifu is actually not going to be as good as people say it is. But I just want to caution you guys because, of course, I think a lot of people are overhyping it, but maybe some people are underhyping it as well, which might sound weird, but definitely, could be the case. So, I think if anything, at least I would try to over-prepare for them earlier on, and once the metagame kind of settle down a little bit, if it turns out that it's actually not as busted as everyone thought they are, well, that's good, right? Because then you don't need to have such dedicated answers against it. You'll definitely want to have early meta counters against Rain. Like I mentioned, I think Rain's going to be super popular, at least in the first few weeks, because naturally everyone's just like, oh, Politoed's back, Kingdra's here, Poliwrath's here, Urshifu's here, Amoonguss is here. Let's just throw all of these onto a Rain team and see how it goes. So I don't know if it's going to be as much of a staple as, say, Sand and Sun were throughout the course of 2020, but I would at least expect to see it a lot in the first couple of weeks. I think the new tutor moves, as I touched on earlier, are going to be really strong, so you should expect players to try to take advantage of their terrain more frequently now. And I think the new G-Maxes they're not going to drastically change the metagame because the Pokemon that are G-Maxing were already pretty much used pretty frequently in the metagame, especially Cinderace and Rillaboom in the previous couple of weeks. But you should definitely be prepared for them. If you're doing damage calcs, try to calc for the highest base power attack, the 160 max moves, as opposed to, say, the 130, 140 ones, because I think trying to EV to survive those as a benchmark will be really important. And finally, I think Tailwind's going to be even more popular. It's just what people always gravitate towards, right? Like, Tailwind was popular when VGC 2020 came out immediately. With dynamic speeds, it's even stronger. Whimsicott's a really good Tailwind user nowadays, and now Talonflame's introduced to kind of, the pool of Pokemon as well. So, I would say to definitely prepare for it maybe harder than usual. At the end of the day, once again, I want to remind you guys, this is just a early metagame preview. These are just some of my thoughts. I just wanted to get you guys acclimated with the rule set, acclimated with some of the Pokemon that you might expect to see and some common strategies. But, of course, 2 weeks from now, we'll actually get to play the metagame, so we'll be able to see what actually is able to do well versus what kind of, flunks out. So, I hope you find this video helpful. There will be a lot more guides coming. I have one that I've been working on that I am really excited to show, which is basically describing some of those top Pokemon returning from previous generations, how I think they'll function in this generation, and giving you guys a sample set. So let me know what other kind of content you would find helpful related to DLC that's not battle related, because of course battles will be coming very shortly. Road to Ranked, as you can imagine, starting on July 1st, we'll have a team ready immediately, and I'm very excited for that. So let me know in the comments below. But hope you find this video helpful. If you did, please show support by leaving a like. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. All right, peace.